Chapter 10 Normality. Who? Klein is thinking about the mysterious suicide of the original owner and the possible unknown danger. When she hears a sudden knock on the door, she subconsciously pulls open the drawer, takes out the revolver, and asks cautiously. There was silence outside the door for 2 seconds, and a slightly shrill voice called out in an aho voice. Me, Mountbatten, Beach, Mountbatten. The voice paused and then added, Police, Beach Mountbatten. As the name came to her ears, Klein immediately thought of its corresponding owner. It was one of the policemen in charge of the block in which the apartment was situated, a rough, brutal, and hands-on man. But perhaps only such a man could shock the drunkards, the thieves, the part-time thieves, and the scoundrels and hooligans. And his distinctive voice is one of his trademarks. Okay, I'll be right there, Klein shouted back. He had intended to throw the revolver back into the drawer, but thinking that the police outside had come for some unknown reason, and that there might be some sort of search, he cautiously ran to the stove, where the embers had long been extinguished, and put the pistol in it. Then he took the small basket of coal, shook a few pieces into the stove, put them over the gun, and finally put the kettle on top to hide everything. Having done all this, he arranged his clothes, walked quickly to the door, and opened it while mumbling, Sorry, just taking a nap. Outside the door stood for police officers in black and white checked uniforms, floppy caps with badges, and brown beards. Mountbatten coughed and said, Talkline, these 3 officers want to ask you something. A police officer, Klein reflexively looked at the epaulets of the other 3, and noticed that 2 had 3 6-pointed silver stars, and 1 had 2, both of which looked better than Beach, who had only 3 V-shaped labels. Mountbatten Sr. As a history major, Klein didn't know much about police epaulets, just Beach. Mountbatten often boasted that he was a senior sheriff. So, those 3 are inspectors? Influenced by the words of classmates like Benson and Welch, Klein still knows a little common sense. He moves away from his body and points to the room. Come in, please. I wonder what it is. The chief of the 3 officers was a fearsome middle-aged man with eyes so sharp that he seemed to be able to see through the mind. His eyes were wrinkled and his light brown hair showed at the edge of his hat. He surveyed the room and asked in a deep voice, Yano Welch, Magwan, what's wrong with him? Klein shuddered and blurted out a question. I'm asking you. The dignified middle-aged policeman had a stern look in his eyes. The officer next to him, also wearing a 3-star epaulet, looked at Klein and smiled gently. Don't be nervous, we're just asking customary questions. The officer was about 30, with a straight nose and gray eyes that were indescribably deep, like a lake in an ancient forest. Klein took a deep breath and said, If you mean the Hoy graduate, Welch from Constanston, Magwan, then I do. We went to school together, under the same tutor, Quentin, Cohen Senior Associate Professor. In the Kingdom of Rune, Professor is not only a title, or a position, just like the combination of professors and department chairs on Earth. That is, a university can only have 1 professor in a department, and associate professors can only wait for their immediate superiors to retire, or force each other out, in view of the need to retain talents. After years of exploration, the Kingdom's Higher Education Commission added senior associate professors to the 3-tier system of lecturers, associate professors, and professors, giving high academic level or seniority enough, but cannot become professors. At this point, Klein looked into the young officer's eyes, considered for a second and said, Tobonist, our relationship was reasonably good, and he and I, along with Naya, met frequently during this time to interpret and discuss the quaternary literature. He had obtained a notebook. Officer, what had happened to him? The middle-aged officer did not answer, but looked sideways at his gray-eyed companion. The officer with ordinary gray eyes and a cap on his badge answered urgently, "I'm sorry, Mr. Welch has passed away." "How come?" Despite some foreboding, Klein couldn't help but cry out in amazement. "Welch is dead like the original owner." "That's kind of scary. What about Naya?" Klein asked hurriedly. "Lady Naya is dead, too. They both died in Mr. Welch's residence," the gray-eyed officer said quietly. "Murdered?" Klein had a vague guess. "Maybe it was suicide." The gray-eyed officer shook his head. "No, from the signs at the scene, they were suicides." Mr. Welch hit his head against the wall, so many times that it got blood all over the wall. And Lady Naya drowned herself in a bird bath. The kind you use to wash your face. "It's impossible." Klein's hair stood on end, as if she could imagine the strange scene. The girl knelt on the chair, buried her face into the basin filled with water, brown hair, soft down, swaying with the wind. The whole person was still. Welch fell to the floor, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his forehead completely shattered and covered in blood. And the wall was hit in one place after another, blood dripping. The gray-eyed officer moved the corners of his mouth and said, "That's what we believe. But the autopsy results and the circumstances of the scene rule out drugs and external force, and there was no sign of resistance from either Mr. Welch or Ms. Naya." Before Klein could speak again, he walked into the room and casually asked, "When was the last time you saw Mr. Welch or Ms. Naya?" He said, gesturing with his eyes to his companion, who had two silver stars. It was a young police officer who looked about Klein's size, with black hair and green eyes, a nice face, and the romantic temperament of a poet. Hearing the question, Klein thought quickly and thought of an answer. It must have been June 26th. We read a new note together. And then I went home to prepare for my interview on the 30th. The interview for the history department at Tingen University. The city of Tingen is known as the city of universities. There are 2 universities, Tingen and Hoi. There are technical schools, barristers, business schools, second only to the capital Bakeland. As soon as he said that, out of the corner of his eye, he saw the young officer go to his desk and pick up the note that was more like a diary. "Oh my goodness, forgot to hide it," Klein shouted out. "You." The young officer smiled back, but did not stop reading his notes, and the gray-eyed officer explained, "It's a necessary procedure." This time, Beach, Mountbatten, and the dignified middle-aged officer only looked on, without interrupting, without assisting in the search. "Where's your search warrant?" Klein was going to ask this question, but on second thought, it seems that the judicial system in Rouen has not yet evolved such a thing as a search warrant. At least he does not know if it has. After all, the police force is only 15 or 16 years old. When the original owner was a kid, he was called the sheriff. Unable to stop, Klein watched as the young officer flipped through his notes, and the gray-eyed officer didn't ask any more questions. What strange things. Turning to the end, the young officer suddenly said, "And what does this mean? Everyone dies, including me. Isn't it common sense that everyone dies except the gods?" Klein was ready to argue, but suddenly thought that he had planned to connect with the police in order to guard against the danger that might be encountered, but suffered from no reason, no excuse. In less than a second, he made his decision, put his hand to his forehead, and answered in a painful voice, "I didn't know. I really don't know. When I woke up this morning, I felt like I wasn't right. I felt like I had forgotten something, especially the last few days, and I didn't even know why I was writing that sentence." Sometimes, frankness is the best way to solve problems. Of course, frankness is about skills. What can be said and what cannot be said is on the one hand, and what should be said first and what should be said later is another. A keyboard expert Klein has also studied a bit of speech. Ridiculous. Do you think we are fools? Beach Mountbatten interjected angrily. He could not bear it. This lie is so clumsy. It is an insult to oneself and other people's intelligence. It's better to pretend you're a psychopath than to have amnesia. Really? Klein responded calmly to Mountbatten and the middle-aged officer's gaze. It really couldn't be more true. Maybe it is. Then the gray-eyed officer spoke slowly. What? So you believe me? Klein was surprised. The gray-eyed officer smiled at him and said, a specialist will be here in a couple of days. And believe me, she should be able to help you recall your lost memories. An expert to help with memory in the field of psychology. Klein frowned. Whoosh! What if this brings up memories of my Earth? He suddenly felt a toothache. The young officer put down his notes and searched the desk and room again. Fortunately, he focused on the books and did not lift the kettle to look at them. Well, Mr. Klein, thank you for your cooperation. You'd better not leave Tingen for the next few days. If you must, please inform Sergeant Mountbatten, or you'll be a fugitive. Gray-eyed Sergeant finally said. So this is the end. Call it a day. No more questions, no more inquiries? Or take me back to the station and torture me? Klein was stunned, but he also wanted to put the weirdness of Welch behind him, so he nodded, "Naproboom." As the officers exited the room, the young man at the end suddenly tapped Klein on the shoulder. Very good, very lucky. What? Klein looked confused. The green-eyed, poet-looking officer smiled. It's normal for all the people involved to die in an incident like this. We are so happy and lucky to see you alive. With that, he went out of the room and closed the door behind him in a polite manner. Is it normal for everyone to die? Glad I'm alive, you know? Lucky I may live. On this summer afternoon, Klein feels cold from his deep heart.